So I told you that I'm going to post this. I'm going to go through a lot of slides here. I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. I'm going to try to. And I'm going to do that just so, one, you're not sitting here listening to it the whole time. But two, you can pause. You can pause right now. You should already have this in particular, but you should pause. You should be able to pause and kind of pick up. I would recommend as soon as I switch over to a slide, go ahead and pause what I'm saying, write down the information, and then move over to the next one. This is the first time I've tried this form of screen capture, so hopefully this will look all right. We'll see. We'll see how everything works out. If it doesn't, let me know, and I'll try to correct it. I hope everybody's having a good Thanksgiving break, by the way. This will be up. I'm hoping this will be up before I leave today on Friday, but the test probably won't be up till Monday. But if I don't know when you're watching this, and getting the notes down, but you want to make sure you have them because I'm going to be asking questions on the test that pertain to these notes, so make sure you got it. So we left off here, we're talking about how not only was Darwin a naturalist, meaning that he cared about the natural world, he was an environmentalist, if you will, one of the first, but he also practiced in what I called observational science. And he observed through just kind of a hobby that he had of breeding exotic pigeons that he could select for certain traits. And he called this process, as we talked about earlier, artificial selection. And that is what kind of drove him to understand this process of natural selection, because it was the idea that it was the same sort of process that he was doing. It was just done through natural environmental pressures as opposed to human-imposed pressures. And Darwin came up with 4 premises that led him to his vast understanding of evolution, and of course his book, The Evolution of Species by Natural Selection. The first is overproduction. This is the idea that every population is capable of producing more offspring than can possibly survive. And we see this a lot with certain animals more so than others, but most organisms will produce a plethora of offspring. Humans are kind of unique in the fact that we only produce one every 9 months. And there's some organisms that actually have a longer, like I've talked about before, a longer gestational period. But most organisms actually overproduce, and they do that for a specific reason. And then there's variation. There's the idea of genetic variation that exists between populations. So just even between you and I, there might be a 5% genetic variation. There's selection, which was, of course, his driving force. It's that certain traits can make an individual more likely or less likely to survive. Thus more likely to address that particular environmental pressure, and some organisms are less likely to address that environmental pressure, and thus are more concerned with survival as opposed to growth and reproduction, which is what's really important to a species. And then finally, the last thing is adaptation, which is the idea that over time, those traits that improve the chances of survival, that make the fittest more able to survive, they're able to not only survive, but they're then able to reproduce, and then thus that particular characteristic, whatever it might be, becomes more common within that species. Okay, so I'm going to go through each one of these and break them down and give you guys a good example of each one. Overproduction on average, sea turtles, for example, lay 110 eggs in a nest. They average between 2 to 8 nests a season. That's a ton of sea turtles when you think about it. And yet these are endangered species, a lot of them. The smallest clutches are laid by flatback turtles with approximately 50 eggs per clutch. The largest clutches have over 200. Why so many? What's the purpose of that? Go back to that real quick. The purpose is that only 1%, quite literally 1 or 2 out of the 100 is going to survive to adulthood. It's going to survive to reproduction age and continue on this species. So it's so important to overproduce because they know that the chances of the survival is literally 1%. So and that's really sad when you think about it. I mean, if you've ever watched sea turtles being hatched, even just getting from the beach to the water, a huge percentage of them are killed off during that process just by predators. Variation is exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea of having variation in between two species, or between a species rather, between one organism to another. Again, I told you that we're pretty similar. There's might be as much as a 5% change from one human to another human. but some species have much more variation than others. Apples have a very high genetic variance. This allows them to be artificially selected for, and that's why there are literally 7,500 varieties of apples. The newest varieties that I think were actually introduced last year is the Cosmic Crisp. It was genetically modified to last in the fridge for a year after it's picked. I mean, that's kind of crazy. And of course, that is an example of artificial selection, not natural selection, but artificial selection in the fact that we have made this particular apple able to survive, or able to stay fresh, remain fresh in a refrigerator for a year after it's initially picked. That's kind of insane. But it's all because of that variation that we're able to do that. Fitness, which goes along with that idea of variation, is the ability to survive and reproduce. Those organisms that are more fit are able to do this more effectively. An old school thought of Darwin's theory was always the fittest survive. That's something that he said in his book. But it still holds true today. We just don't use that term fitness nearly as much. What we use instead really is adaptations, which is a trait that improves an individual's fitness or improves their likelihood of survival, and more than survival, their likelihood of reproduction. So I'm going to try and play this for you guys. This just shows how adaptation can result in some crazy changes within a species. So here we have lemurs of Madagascar. You guys have seen maybe the movie Madagascar. It's that old cartoon. And they show this like cute, adorable little lemurs, lots of them. They're not as cute and as adorable as you might think because they have been specifically adapted for very specific traits. So let's go ahead and play this video. It's short.
Night falls in the jungles of Madagascar, and the nocturnal animals emerge from their hiding places to hunt. This is the aye-aye, a lemur, and probably the world's strangest mammal. Its ghostly aspect has lent it its name. The word lemur in Latin means night spirit. One of the fingers on their hands is much longer than the others, and this is used to dig into the bark of trees to extract insect larvae, their main food source. When they cannot find larvae, they also feed on mushrooms, fruit, and nuts. They have very large eyes and well-developed senses of both hearing and smell, allowing them to survive at night. But the aye-aye lemur is in danger of extinction due to the indiscriminate felling of forests in Madagascar.
You can see him working that finger there, trying to extract as much larvae as he can. I'm going to go ahead and pause this. Doesn't really get into much more. But the idea here, guys, is that I wanted to show you an organism that has obviously been very clearly adapted for a very specific work case, for a very specific environmental pressure. So here, this aye-aye found a niche in the Madagascar forest that was not filled. Now, they had to kind of equip themselves with a very specific adaptation in the form of that elongated finger, the larger eyes, the enlarged ears, so that they can, one, be nocturnal. That's where the eyes and the ears kind of come into play. And then two, hunt for a very specific food, one that was not being hunted for by many before it. So that's where you see those adaptations. And those adaptations have enabled that particular aye-aye lemur survival. It's enabled them to survive where maybe other species variants weren't able to survive. So this is just another adaptation. Here we have a cacti or a cactus rather, that is found in a very dry area. You can see the tuber down at the bottom that engorges itself with water when water is available, and that's usually protected because it's underneath the surface of the soil. Just an adaptation that is spread throughout most of those organisms. Here's just showing on this particular aloe vera, the cuticle, the wax cuticle that covers these leaves, again to prevent water from seeping out, water from being evaporated off in these very dry climates. Another adaptation that has enabled it to survive. All right, so evolution by random processes. So there are we talked about the premises that he had. Now we're going to talk about the factors that drive evolution. And one of them is mutation. It says here in this little guy, mutation can arise in a population, and if it is not lost, may increase the frequency over time. So as you guys can see, the mutation in this example was the black mouse, and then over time that black permeated itself through the species and has now become a permanent fixture of that species. Genetic drift. So this is another one of those factors that drives evolution. This is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time as a result of random mating. So, and it says here in letter B, it kind of highlights that. It says, in a large population, the genetic composition trends to remain the same over time. In a small population, however, some phenotypes can be lost by chance, and the genetic composition can change over time. So we see this a lot more. Over time, large populations tend to keep whatever characteristics they have, whatever percentages they have. However, in small populations, they can become lost or gained very quickly. So you guys can kind of see that down at the bottom here. We have an example where we had 40% black mice in a much smaller population, but because maybe by chance one of those black mice died off, now, in successive generations, we see very few of them. So smaller populations are more impacted by genetic drift than larger populations. Bottleneck effect is another driving factor of evolution that's interesting. It's a drastic reduction in the size of a population, resulting in the reduction of genetic diversity. So again, we have an initial population here, a large population of mice that have a variety of colors. We have black, brown, and white furred mice. However, by some sort of bottleneck, and oftentimes this is we call this sort of the gorge theory, where maybe some river separated this mouse population and broke it in half, and by chance, an entire subsect, 50% of the population was originally white, but an entire genotype was lost because of that bottleneck effect, that change, whatever it was. Now the resulting population that comes after it is lacking that white phenotype that was present in the original population. Founder's effect, and this is another example where we have a few individuals that will leave the mainland for whatever reason. And this is actually interesting because this is what he was recognizing, Darwin was recognizing when he looked at finches. They had flown over from the mainland to the Galapagos Islands, and so he was really categorizing this effect more than anything else. It's a change in population from a small number of colonizing individuals. So if you take, let's say I took dogs, we talked about dogs a lot now. If I have all these different species of dogs, but I just took 10 Chihuahuas, and I put them on an island and let them breed on their own, they're probably going to die because they're Chihuahuas and they don't survive very well. But let's say for some reason they were able to survive. They would form a population of just Chihuahuas, even though those dogs have a lot of different characteristics, and they are the same species as I talked about as the gray wolf, and they have all of those other different sort of factors within their genes, that variation within their genes. They would be very similar to their original species, and that again is called the founder's effect, because you're founding a new area, and it results in the drastic change in the population. So I want to play one more video for you which talks about genetic drift, and it does a nice job. This is the Amoeba Sisters, and they have a few videos on this topic, but this does a nice job kind of highlighting it.
So here's a question for you. Have you ever compared the candy you get on Halloween with your friends? My sister and I, a bit competitive in the sport of Halloween candy hunting, we both had preferences of which kind of candy we hoped to get in our buckets each year. And as for me, I love gummy bears. And every once in a while, someone would have them mixed in a big bucket, and I remember watching with intense focus the hand that picked out the candy hoping for gummy bears. Getting those gummy bears was always total luck, total chance. Well, unless, of course, the entire bucket they had was actually gummy bears, but that would not be luck. No, that would be pure bliss. But that's never happened to me, yet. So why bring this up? Well, what if instead of candy, we were talking about insects? And they weren't in a Halloween bucket because that'd be kind of gross. They're on the sidewalk. And when you're scooter riding through the neighborhood on Halloween to collect candy because scooters may or may not be our super awesome childhood mode of transportation, you squash some. Accidentally, of course, because you like insects overall. Were the ones that survived better adapted? Did they have some special ability to foresee events or to move your scooter away from them? Well, assuming they were all just there on the sidewalk in the path of your trick-or-treating, then no. In this random event example, the survivors were not better adapted. They were lucky. It was chance. And the ones that were squashed were, in this case, at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's what genetic drift is. Genetic drift can change allele frequencies in a population. Remember, alleles are a form of a gene, but genetic drift is random, unlike natural selection. Recall that in our natural selection video, organisms that have traits that result in high fitness are able to pass those alleles on to their offspring. This is where that survival of the fittest comes into play, but not genetic drift. With genetic drift, the organisms aren't necessarily more fit. They just have won the game of chance. So let's look at a representation of genetic drift known as the bottleneck effect. I always like to remember this one by focusing on the word bottle. Well, let's say that we have a bottle here and we fill it with our Halloween candy. If we shake it out and we only get a few of the candy pieces, does it necessarily represent the whole bottle as far as the candy frequencies you got out? Nope. In fact, one of the types of candy pieces isn't even there. That type is totally eliminated. We'll consider a natural disaster, such as a forest fire. The surviving organisms weren't better adapted. They were likely just in an area where they weren't directly affected. But the survivors don't happen to represent the original population, so there's definitely going to be a new allele frequency among the surviving population. Bottleneck effect. Another time to see genetic drift is when you're talking about the founder effect. In this case, you may have organisms that have founded an island or some new area. The few organisms that arrive to start a new population do not necessarily represent the original population that they came from. Let's take a case where maybe some seeds that are dispersed by wind end up in a new area that happened to be one that was ideal for their growth. This new population grows. Well, those seeds that landed in this new area may not necessarily represent the original population of plants from which they came from. It's a random sample, founder effect. In summary, genetic drift can make some big changes to allele frequencies, and it's a mechanism for evolution. So one last thing. Which type of population do you think would be more vulnerable to genetic drift? A big population or a small population? If someone is just doing some intense candy hunting and by accident scooter rides over a few insects, look at the results in the small population versus the big population. As you can see, this random event has the potential to cause more change from the original in the small population. See, there weren't as many representatives there in the first place. So in many incidences of genetic drift in populations, the impact on small populations is especially significant. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right. So, I want to talk about speciation and extinction. Kind of continuing on, and rewatch that video because I think it does a nice job of talking about those factors that are not environmentally influenced but are driven by chance. So, if you need to rewatch that, feel free to do so. Speciation is the making of a new species. This usually results in the form of macroevolution, where we take small changes of microevolution over time, and eventually you have a species that's unrecognizable from the start, from what it was at the start. It's become something different, something entirely new. It has become a new species. So, and that's what that is. That's what it's characterized there. It's the moving from micro to the macro evolution. Geographical isolation is a part of this, and it can cause speciation. It's a separation due to geographical barriers. So again, and I kind of talked about this a little bit when I talked about the squirrel idea, but if you had an earthquake, okay, that caused a big crevice in between to squirrel families. And again, part of that squirrel family, and this goes back again to the founder's effect, but part of that squirrel family became isolated on one part of the cliff as opposed to the other part, the original population that was on another part of the cliff. They're going to, based off of the limited amount of alleles that are present within that particular gene pool, they're going to develop into a slightly different species as opposed to the other one. This is called geographical isolation, and islands are especially ripe with this because they are off of the mainland, and species usually they live undisturbed for long periods of time, and they live independently of the mainland. So that's why it was so important that Darwin went to his Galapagos Islands to see that. Allopatric speciation is where we have geographic isolation forces two species to adapt differently. Eventually, they cannot breed. So it's the idea that you take this geographical isolation and it results in two very distinct species because of the slight variations of environmental pressures in that geographically isolated spot as opposed to the original spot. So here we have an example of that. We have the original field. Because of a flood, the river rises and splits that population. Over many generations, each population evolves independently. So I think these are mice, but you see that we started off with a lot of black and white mice, but again, over time, because of that isolation, that physical barrier separating those two, you get a species that is primarily white and a species that is primarily black as a result of this. Over many generations, the population evolves independently. It says eventually the two populations become genetically distinct. So it becomes an issue where now those two species can no longer interbreed. It's very possible, for example, that like tigers and lions, they arrived from a common ancestor. In fact, I'm sure that they were. And they probably were able to interbreed at one point. But over time, because of the differences in their genomes, as well as where they were located, the environmental pressures that they faced, they changed so much, they adapted so much that they can no longer interbreed. They become two distinct species. This is what Darwin really was fascinated with. It was this idea of finches. And he noticed, this was actually a couple of years after his voyage, he was looking back over his notes and he noticed that every finch that he drew had a different beak shape. And he hypothesized that each beak shape was corresponded with a particular niche within that ecosystem that enabled them to survive off of a particular food source. And because of that, they had evolved into distinct species of finch that were specialized in that particular food source. Sympatric speciation is the evolution of one species into two species without geographic isolation. So this is more rare, but it definitely happens, especially in polyploidal individuals, polyploidal organisms. These are organisms that have multiple sets of DNA. So they have a lot of DNA to choose from, and usually they have more genetic variation. And this is usually only found in plants, where we get a plant species that will mutate to have more than two rather sets of chromosomes. Just like me and you and most other organisms, we are diploid, meaning we have two sets of DNA. Two pairs of chromosomes for each sort of segment of our DNA. And so we have, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes in order to accomplish that. And those two chromatids, are called sister chromatids that make up the one chromosome. However, there are some organisms that through just mutation will become a polyploidal, meaning they'll have multiple sets of DNA as opposed to just two. And because of that enables them, usually they're larger in size, and you can see that with wheat here. Common wheat is polyploidal, meaning that it has these larger kernels. So it results in kind of an enlarged version of the original organism, and it also usually results in an inability to breed between those two species because it's resulting in sympatric speciation. So two distinct species from one. So the pace of evolution is pretty quick, depending on how you look at geological time. But it's one new species every 3 million years. There are four factors that influence the successful evolutionary change, and that is the rate of environmental change, which is truly important. Genetic variation, of course, the amount of variation we have within our genes. Population size, because remember, some of those effects have more effect on a smaller population than a larger one. And then generation time. Generation time is probably the most prevalent one, the one that you see in the research the most, if you can regenerate, if you can have a new set of offspring, a new generation really quickly, you're more likely to see evolution quickly. And that just makes sense. For us, we only see a successful generation like every 100 years. A generation will live 100 years. But that's not the case with things like fruit flies, where they have a new generation usually every week or so. All right. So these graphs, and I really want you to get these graphs down. Go ahead and put them in your notes. They highlight this. It's the idea of a rate of environmental change. If it's fast, so if you change the environment really quickly, you get less changes over time, so you get less evolution. If it's a slow change over time, you get greater evolution. And that's because usually species can't adapt that quickly. And right now, that's one of the big issues that we have, is that we are changing the environment quicker than species can adapt. And that's why I just read an article yesterday, sadly, that 98% of all corals off the coast of Florida are now gone. And again, that goes back to that idea of coral bleaching that we talked about. It's the fact that these corals cannot adapt to this changing ocean temperatures that we're causing because of global climate change, because of pollution that is man-made. So we don't want it to be super fast. We don't want change to be super fast. We want the genetic variation to be high. The more genetic variation we have, the more genetic variation we have, the greater the amount, the greater the possibility of evolution, because you just have more variation to choose from. Okay, dogs, for example. I mean, we can breed them to do all sorts of different things because they are so pliable with the amount of genetic variation that they have. Population size, again, larger populations resist evolutionary change. Smaller populations demand almost evolutionary change, simply because it takes less time to see an adaptation go through a species if that species population is small. I mean, think about it. It just takes fewer generations for it to go into the entire species, and then for that species to thus change quicker over time. All right. We can genetically modify things. We are beginning the process of understanding evolution and actually going in, and rather than just selectively breeding, we are actually starting to go in and alter genes within certain things. Usually food's the big one. I talked about the apple crisp, or the crisp apple, or cosmic crisp apple. That was through genetic engineering. We also have genetically engineered. Monsanto was the first company. I told you that they're kind of evil. They are. They were the first company to ever patent life. So they produced a strain of corn and soybeans that were genetically modified to be resistant to certain bacteria, so that you can actually spray things on them and not kill them, where it would kill other corn and soybean plants. And because that was genetically modified by a company, they owned the right to do that. They thus patented that life, and it's really weird to think that they own a life form, because that's just odd. I mean, we don't usually own life forms, but they did that. They accomplished that through genetic engineering, which is the direct manipulation of genes. Genetically modified organisms are the result of that, where organisms either have genes altered, inserted, or even deleted. And you eat food, by the way, that has been genetically modified. You guys have probably had some sort of like cereal today. If you had Rice Krispies or Captain Crunch or Frosted Flakes, those are almost all genetically modified foods. So if you guys ate that today, you probably ate some GMOs. If you've eaten an ear of corn, you've probably eaten some GMOs, some genetically modified organisms. And there's benefits to that, and then there's some things that we're not 100% sure. How is manipulating their DNA going to affect us as we ingest that? Because we weren't meant to ingest a food that had that kind of DNA. It wasn't natural. It wasn't naturally occurring. So evolution shapes ecological niches. We kind of talked about that, how the that lemur that we saw has a very specific set of adaptations to enable it to survive, enable it to have its ecological niche where it's eating larvae found in bark. and it determines species distributions usually. Range tolerance is the limits to the abiotic conditions that a species can tolerate. A niche is that role that a species inhabits inside of its ecosystem. The fundamental niche is the ideal conditions. It's where the species will survive the best using its tool set. The realized niche, however, is what you actually see. It's where the organism actually lives. So let me kind of just show you what I mean by that. Here we have a temperature range as well as a performance. So at the very crest of this curve, we have a species' ability to survive, grow, and reproduce. This is its fundamental niche. However, you'll see that the colored portion all the way to the white on the very edge of this bell curve, that is the realized niche, where a species can survive. It can survive, it can grow. However, it's not necessarily in its ideal niche. It's not its ideal temperature range. If it gets past those areas, let me go back to that, the species will die. So whatever this organism is, it will die. But it can live in these sort of extremes, but its best place is right there in the middle. So let's talk a little bit about the species record. I told you guys that was one of the big things that Darwin pushed for. And again, I don't mean to rush. If you guys need to stop, we're already 30 minutes in, so feel free to stop it. And if you need to pick back up on this after or in a little bit, go ahead and do that. Whatever you need to do. But we're almost done. So I'm gonna press through. We'll probably get done with like 35 minutes or so. So 99% of the species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct, and the main reason is because that realized niche was outsourced. They didn't have the realized niche that they needed. Something changed in the environment. Some environmental pressure caused them to die out. They weren't able to adapt quick enough. Fossils, the fossil record is our primary source of looking back in time at different organisms and how they were adapted for those specific characteristics of the environment. Fossil is the remains of an organism that has been preserved in rock. When it comes to the fossil record, the oldest fossils are found at the bottom of that record. There have been 5 global mass extinctions. And this is really important for us to understand, especially when it comes to environmental science, mainly because of number 6, which we'll talk about here in a second. But revealed through the fossil record, we've noticed that there have been 5 times where mass extinctions have occurred. The greatest mass extinction was 251 million years ago, where 90% of marine organisms and 70% of land organisms died off. Most recent one, we're kind of due for one, to be honest. It was 65 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. Where half of the species, including all of the dinosaurs, went extinct. I just read an article today that said that some believe that the dinosaurs would have remained the dominant species on Earth if it wasn't for this extinction, and it would have resulted in a change for us. We probably wouldn't have risen to the dominant species on Earth as we are now. And of course, we believe that it was a meteorite that hit the Earth and caused that extinction. This is a timescale showing the extinctions and the events that we're seeing. So it goes through each one of these arrows represents one of those extinction events. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what's interesting, I don't know if it shows this, but we are currently, and this is the last slide, by the way, we are currently on the 6th mass extinction. That's the depressing part about this. 2 to 25% of species could be lost by 2025. One of those might be the coral reefs that I've talked about recently. That is in danger of being, literally every animal that I've shown you today, with the exception of the mice, are in danger of being extinct. And this is almost entirely due to anthropomorphic causes, human causes. If it's not the destruction of their habitat, the changing in climates, or just some sort of emerging disease, something to do with us and our activities causing this mass extinction, causing this great change. And that's why this class, I think, is so important. That's why we need to stay diligent. We need to learn about this so that we can make conscious as consumers. Even if you guys don't go into a field of environmental science or even science in general, as consumers, I think we need to be conscious of this, and we need to select we need to make purchases, because money is power. Money, follow the money, and you'll find pretty much everything in the world. But we need to use money influentially. We need to say that I'm only going to buy from a company who is recycling. I'm only going to buy from a company who is offsetting their carbon expenditure by doing things like installing solar panels or planting trees. They're offsetting their carbon footprint. I'm only going to buy from. I'm going to instead of buying a combustion engine car, I'm going to buy an electric car because it's better for the environment in the long run. It's not initially better, but it's better over the long haul. These are choices that, as an educated consumer, you guys need to start making. And I realize that you're sitting there going, well, I don't buy cars, I don't buy houses, I don't do these things, but you will. You will. That's the thing. You guys are so close to financial independence and just being done kind of with your immediate family and starting a life on your own. These are the kind of decisions that you're going to be faced with, and I just hope that you realize that rather than adding to this mass extinction, I hope that we detract from it. All right, guys, listen, hey, I hope you're having a great Thanksgiving. Thank you for listening. Thanks for watching. I will have, like I said, that test out to you guys here soon. Talk to you soon. Bye.